the irony is that atheism is completely without content. It is not a philosophical position. And all religious people are atheists with respect to everyone else's religion. I mean, we're all atheists with respect to the thousands of dead gods who lie in that mass grave we call mythology. I mean, think of Thor and Isis and Zeus. You know, these were once gods in good standing among our ancestors. Everyone now rejects them. Well, actually not everyone. I occasionally get hate mail from people who do believe in Zeus, but that's another story. But more importantly, every Christian rejects the claims of Islam, just as I do. You know, Muslims claim that they have the perfect word of the creator of the universe. Why do they believe this? Because it says so in the book. Sorry, not good enough. So this term atheism really is misleading. We're talking about specific truth claims and their evidence, or lack thereof. Now, what about the charge that atheism is dogmatic? Let's get this straight. Jews, Christians, and Muslims claim that their holy books are so profound, so prescient of humanity's needs, that they could have only been written by an omniscient being. An atheist is simply a person who has entertained this claim, read the books, and found the claim to be ridiculous. This is not dogmatism. There's nothing that an atheist needs to believe on insufficient evidence in order to reject the biblical God. What dogma have we all embraced to not take Apollo and Zeus into account as we go about our day? Would it be dogmatic to doubt that the Iliad or the Odyssey was dictated by the creator of the universe? The atheist is simply saying, as Carl Sagan did, that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. If ever there were an antidote to dogmatism, this is it. There's a related claim that atheists and scientists generally are arrogant. Now, this is rather ironic. The truth is that when scientists don't know something, like why the universe came into being or how the first self-replicating molecules formed on Earth, they tend to admit it. Pretending to know things you do not know is a profound liability in science. You get punished for this rather quickly. But pretending to know things you do not know is the lifeblood of faith-based religion. This is really one of the profound ironies of religious discourse, in the frequency with which you can hear religious people praise themselves for their humility while tacitly claiming to know things about cosmology and physics and chemistry and paleontology that no scientist knows. Any person who dignifies Genesis as an account of creation, or even as informative, is essentially saying to someone like Stephen Hawking, Stephen, you're a smart guy, and I see you got a lot of equations over there, but you don't know enough about cosmology. It says here that God did this in 6 days and then rested on the seventh, and I don't see how you've really grappled with the nuances of the biblical account. This would be amusing if it were not having such a disastrous effect upon our public policy. It is impeding medical research and the teaching of science in this country. 30% of biology teachers in the United States at the high school level don't even mention evolution because of the hassle occasioned by the religious hysteria that it provokes in their students and their students' parents.
What I have discovered in voyaging around this country and others in this debate, and just debating with Hindus, with Muslims, with the Jews, with Christians of all stripes, is that the arguments are all essentially the same for belief in the supernatural, for belief in faith, for belief in God, but that there are very interesting and noteworthy discrepancies between them. And one that I want to call attention to at the beginning of this evening is between those like my friend Doug Wilson, with whom I've now done a book of argument about Christian apologetics, who would call himself a presuppositionalist. In other words, for whom really it's only necessary to discover the workings of God's will in the cosmos, and to assume that the truth of Christianity is already proven. and what are called, and they include Dr. Craig with great honor and respect in this, the evidentialists. Now, I want to begin by saying that this distinction strikes me first as a very charming distinction, and second as false, or perhaps as a distinction without a difference. Well, why do I say charming? Because I think it's rather sweet that people of faith also think they ought to have some evidence. And I think it's progress of a kind. After all, if we had been having this debate in the mid-19th century, Professor Craig or his equivalent would have known little or probably nothing about the laws of physics and biology. Maybe even less than I know now, which is to say quite a lot in its way. And they would have grounded themselves, or he would have grounded himself, on faith, on Scripture, on revelation, on the prospect of salvation, on the means of grace, and the hope of glory, and perhaps on Paley's natural theology. Paley, who had the same rooms, or had the same rooms later occupied by Charles Darwin in Cambridge, with its watchmaker theory of design that I know I don't have to expound to you, but which briefly suggests that if an Aborigine is walking along a beach and finds a gold watch ticking, he knows not what it's for, or where it came from, or who made it, but he knows it's not a rock, he knows it's not a vegetable, he knows it must have had a designer. The Paley analogy held for most Christians for many years because they were willing to make the assumption that we were mechanisms and that therefore there must be a watchmaker. But now that it's been, here's where the presuppositionalist versus evidentialist dichotomy begins to kick in. Now it's been rather painstakingly and elaborately demonstrated to the satisfaction of most people. I don't want to just use arguments from authority, but it's not very much contested anymore, that we are not designed as creatures, but that we evolved by a rather laborious combination of random mutation and natural selection into the species that we are today. It is, of course, open to the faithful to say that all this was, now that they come to know it, now that it becomes available to everybody, now that they think about it, and now that they've stopped opposing it or trying to ban it, then they can say, actually, on second thought, the evolution was all part of the design. Well, as you will recognize, ladies and gentlemen, there are some arguments I can't be expected to refute or rebut because there's no way around that argument. I mean, if everything, including evolution, which isn't a design, is nonetheless part of a divine design, then all the advantage goes to the person who's willing to believe that. That cannot be disproved. But it does seem to me a very poor, very weak argument because the test of a good argument is that it is falsifiable, not that it's unfalsifiable. So this tactic or this style of argument, which we've had some evidence of this evening, I would rebaptize, or might I dare say I would rechristen it, as retrospective evidentialism. In other words, everything can, in due time, if you have enough faith, be made to fit. And you too are all quite free to believe that a sentient creator deliberately, consciously put himself or herself or itself to the trouble of going through huge epochs of birth and death of species over eons of time, in which 99%, in the course of which at least 99.9% of all species, all life forms ever to have appeared on Earth have become extinct, as we nearly did as a species ourselves. I invite you to look up the very alarming and beautiful and brilliant account by the National Geographic's coordinator of the Genome Project. By the way, you should send in your little sample from the inside of your cheek and have your African ancestry traced. It's absolutely fascinating to follow the mitochondrial DNA that we all have in common and that we have in common with other species, other primates, and other life forms, and find out where in Africa you came from. But there came a time, probably about 180,000 years ago, when, due to a terrible climatic event, probably in Indonesia, an appalling global warming crisis occurred. And the estimate is that the number of humans in Africa went down to between 40 and 30,000. This close, think about fine-tuning, this close to joining every other species that had gone extinct. And that's our Exodus story, is that somehow we don't know how, because it's not written in any scripture, it's not told in any book, it's not part of any superstitious narrative, but somehow the escape from Africa to cooler latitudes was made. But that's how close it was. You have to be able to imagine that all this mass extinction and death and randomness is the will of a being. You are absolutely free to believe that if you wish. And all of this should happen so that one very imperfect race of evolved primates should have the opportunity to become Christians or to turn up at this gym tonight. That all of that was done with us in view. It's a curious kind of solipsism. It's a curious kind of self-centeredness. I was always brought up to believe that Christians were modest and humble and comported themselves with due humility. And there's a certain arrogance to this assumption that all of this extraordinary development was all about us. And we were the intended and designed result, and everything else was in the discard. The tremendous wastefulness of it, the tremendous cruelty of it, the tremendous caprice of it, the tremendous tinkering and incompetence of it, never mind. At least we're here, and we can be people of faith. It doesn't work for me, I have to simply say that, and I think there may be questions of psychology involved in this as well. Believe it if you can. I can't stop you. Believe it if you like. You're welcome. It's obviously impossible, as I said before, to disprove, and it equally obviously helps you to believe it if, as we all are, you're in the happy position of knowing the outcome. In other words, we are here, but there's a fallacy lurking in there somewhere too. Is there not? Now, it's often said, it was said tonight, and Dr. Craig said it in print, that atheists think they can prove the non-existence of God. This, in fact, very slightly but crucially misrepresents what we've always said. There's nothing new about the new atheists, it's just we're recent. There's nothing particularly new. Dr. Victor Stenger, a great scientist, has written a book called The Failed Hypothesis, which he says he thinks that science can now license the claim that there definitely is no God, but he's unique in that and I think very bold and courageous. Here's what we argue. We argue quite simply that there's no plausible or convincing reason, certainly no evidential one, to believe that there is such an entity and that all observable phenomena, including the cosmological one to which I'm coming, are explicable without the hypothesis. You don't need the assumption. And this objection itself, our school falls into at least two, perhaps three sections. There's no such thing, no such word, though there should be, as adeism or as being an adeist, but if there was one, I would say that's what I was. I don't believe that we are here as the result of a design, or that by making the appropriate propitiations and adopting the appropriate postures and following the appropriate rituals, we can overcome death. I don't believe that, and for a priori reasons, don't. If there was such a force, which I cannot prove by definition that there was not, if there was an entity that was responsible for the beginning of the cosmos, and that also happened to be busily engineering the very laborious production of life on our little planet, it still wouldn't prove that this entity cared about us, answered prayers, cared what church we went to, or whether we went to one at all, cared who we had sex with, or in what position, or by what means, cared what we ate, or on what day, cared whether we lived or died. There's no reason at all why this entity isn't completely indifferent to us. You cannot get from deism to theism except by a series of extraordinarily generous to yourself assumptions. The deist has all his work still ahead of him to show that it leads to revelation, to redemption, to salvation, or to suspensions of the natural order, in which hitherto you've been putting all your faith, all your evidence is on scientific and natural evidence, or why not, for a change of pace and a change of taste, say yes, but sometimes this same natural order, which is so miraculous in observation, no question about it, is so impressive in its favoring the conditions for life in some ways, but it's randomly suspended when miracles are required. So with caprice and contempt, these laws turn out not to be so important after all, as long as the truth of religion can be proved by their being rendered inoperative. This is having it both ways in the most promiscuous and exorbitant manner in my submission. Bear in mind also that these are not precisely the differences between Dr. Craig and myself, I mean, morally or intellectually equivalent claims. After all, Dr. Craig, to win this argument, has to believe and prove to a certainty. He's not just saying there might be a God, because he has to say there must be one, otherwise we couldn't be here and there couldn't be morality. It's not a contingency for him. I have to say that I appear as a skeptic who believes that doubt is the great engine, the great fuel of all inquiry, all discovery, and all innovation, and that I doubt these things. The disadvantage, it seems to me, in the argument goes to the person who says, no, I know it, it must be true, it is true. We're too early in the study of physics or biology, it seems to me, to be dealing in certainties of that kind, especially when the stakes are so high. It seems to me, to put it in a condensed form, extraordinary claims, such as the existence of a divine power with a son who cares enough to come and redeem us, extraordinary claims require truly extraordinary evidence. I don't think any of the evidence we heard from Dr. Craig, brilliantly marshaled as it was extraordinary enough to justify the extreme claims that are being made and backed by it. Hypocrisy, said La Rochefoucauld, is the compliment that vice pays to virtue. Retrospective evidentialism strikes me in something of the same sort of light. It's a concession made to the need for fact. Maybe we better have some evidence to go along with our faith. But look at what Dr. Craig says in his book. He says, I'll quote directly, he says, should a conflict arise between the witness of the Holy Spirit to the fundamental truth of the Christian faith and beliefs based on argument and evidence, then it is the former which must take precedence over the latter. He adds not vice versa, but a good editor, I think, would have told you, you don't have to put the vice versa in. It's clear enough as it is. I'll say it again. Should a conflict arise between the witness of the Holy Spirit to the fundamental truth of the Christian faith and beliefs based on argument and evidence, then it's the former which must take precedence over the latter. That's not evidentialism. That's just faith. It's a priori belief. It's rephrased in another edition. It says, therefore, the role of rational argumentation in knowing Christianity to be true is the role of a servant. A person knows Christianity is true because the Holy Spirit tells him it is true. And while argument and evidence can be used to support this conclusion, they cannot legitimately overrule it. Now, then he goes on to say, the Bible says all men are without excuse. Even those who are given no reason to believe, and many persuasive reasons to disbelieve, have no excuse, because the ultimate reason they do not believe is that they have deliberately rejected God's Holy Spirit. That would have to be me. But you see where this lands you, ladies and gentlemen, with the Christian apologetic. You're told you're a miserable sinner who is without excuse. You've disappointed your God in who made you, and you've been so ungrateful as to rebel. You're contemptible, you're worm-like, but you can take heart. The whole universe was designed with just you in mind. These two claims are not just mutually exclusive, but I think they're intended to compensate each other's cruelty and ultimately absurdity. In other words, evidence is an occasional convenience. Seek and ye shall find. I remember being told that in church many a time as a young lad. Seek and ye shall find. I thought it was a sinister injunction, because it's all too likely to be true. We are pattern-seeking mammals and primates. If we can't get good evidence, we'll go for junk evidence. If we can't get a real theory, we'll go with a conspiracy theory. You see it all the time. Religion's great strength is that it was the first of our attempts to explain reality, to make those patterns take some kind of form. It deserves credit. It was our first attempt at astronomy, our first attempt at cosmology, in some ways our first attempt at medicine, our first attempt at literature, our first attempt at philosophy. Good. While there was nothing else, it had many functional uses of that kind. Never mind that they didn't know that germs cause disease. Maybe evil spirits cause disease. Maybe disease is a punishment. Never mind that they believed in astrology rather than astronomy. Even Thomas Aquinas believed in astrology. Never mind that they believed in devils. Never mind that things like volcanic eruptions, earthquakes, tidal waves were thought of as punishments, not as natural occurrences on the cooling crust of a planet. The pattern seeking has gone too far. And it's gone, I think, much too far with what was until recently thought of as Christianity's greatest failure, greatest of all failures, cosmology. The one thing Christianity knew nothing about and taught the most abject nonsense about. For most of its lifetime, Christianity taught that the earth itself was the center of the universe, and we had been given exclusive dominion as a species over it. It could not have been more wrong. How are we going to square the new cosmology, the fantastic new discoveries in physics, with the old dogmas? Well, one is the idea of this fine-tuning, about which I've only left myself 3.5 minutes. I'll have to refer some of this to later in the discussion. This is essentially another form of pattern seeking on the basis of extremely limited evidence. Most physicists are very uncertain, as they have every right to be. In fact, I would say, for physicists, that as they have the duty to be at the moment, extremely uncertain about the spatio-temporal dimensions of the original episode, the Big Bang, as it's sometimes called. We're in the very, very early stages of this inquiry. We hardly know what we don't know about the origins of the universe. We're viewing it from an unimaginable distance, not just an unimaginable distance in space. We're perched on a tiny rock in an extremely small suburb of a fairly minor galaxy, trying to look to discern our origins, but also at an unbelievable distance in time. And we claim the right to say, we can see the finger of God in this process. It's an extraordinarily arrogant assumption. It either deserves a Nobel Prize in physics, which it hasn't yet got, I notice. I don't know any physicist who believes these assumptions are necessary, or it deserves a charge of hubris. Let me make 3 tiny, quick objections to it as it stands, and I'm no more a physicist than most of you are. I'll make these lay objections. 1, was there pre-existing material for this extra spatio-temporal being to work with? Or did he just will it into existence, the ex nihilo? Who designed the designer? Don't you run the risk with the presumption of a God and a designer and an originator of asking, well, where does that come from? Where does that come from? And locking yourself into an infinite regress. Why are there so many shooting stars, collapsed suns, failed galaxies? We can see with the aid of a telescope. Sometimes we can see with the naked eye. The utter failure, the total destruction of gigantic, unimaginable sweeps of outer space. Is this fine-tuning, or is it extremely random, capricious, cruel, mysterious, and incompetent? And have you thought of the nothingness that's coming? We know we have something now, and we speculate about what it might have come from, and there's a real question about ex nihilo, but nihilo is coming to us. In the night sky, you can already see the Andromeda Galaxy. It's heading straight for ours on a collision course. Is that part of a design? Was it fine-tuned to do that? We know that from the red light shift of the Hubble telescope, or rather Edwin Hubble's original discovery, the universe is expanding away from itself at a tremendous rate. It was thought that rate would go down for Newtonian reasons. No, it's recently been proved by Professor Lawrence Krauss, the rate of expansion is increasing. Everything is exploding away even faster. Nothingness is certainly coming. Who designed that? And that's all if before these things happen, we don't have the destruction of our own little solar system, in which already there's only one planet where anything like life can possibly be supported. All the other planets are too hot or too cold to support any life at all, and the sun is due to swell up, burn us to a crisp, boil our oceans and die, as we've seen all the other suns do in the night sky. This is not fine-tuning, ladies and gentlemen, and if it's the work of a designer, then there's an indictment to which that designer may have to be subjected. I'm out of time. I'm very grateful for your kindness and hospitality.
Children can accept anything, can accept the fairy stories, can accept the legends, can accept the religious teachings of their community, can believe in the Tooth Fairy and in Father Christmas. But the one thing which retains powerful social reinforcement after they've given up their credulity in things like Father Christmas is religion. If you live in a Christian community, you're surrounded by churches, there are church services on the radio, there's Christmas, there's Easter. We talk about the Church of England, C of E, Christmas and Easter, that's what most people go for. But the fact that they still go for it is a reinforcement. And so children continue to think that there must be something serious behind it if so many grown-ups get dressed up like the Archbishop of Canterbury and appear on telly. The Father Christmas thing and the Tooth Fairy thing don't get reinforced in that way. And therefore, there is a job of work to be done. The job of work involves trying to get people, children especially, to think a bit critically about the sorts of things that people believe and why they believe them. This is a very, very familiar point. You want to demand of people that they be rational in their beliefs. And what you mean by rational is that there should be a ratio, a proportion, between the grounds that they have for thinking something about the world, the beliefs that they hold, and those beliefs themselves. That if somebody makes a claim about how the world is, that they've got to come up with a robust case. And they should be open to having that case examined. And they should explain to you what would count as confuting or even refuting that case. And if they don't do that, if it's a matter of bare assertion or appeal to tradition or appeal to authority, that can't be good enough. And so that's the job of work that we have to do on the metaphysical front. And it has to be done in a number of different ways, not just by addressing the claims made about the nature of the universe, that it was created by a powerful agency designed on purpose to fulfill certain functions and so on. Not just that, but also by inviting people to think a little bit about the origins and the history of the religions. To look, for example, at how the religions have behaved in history, and to ask whether that stands up to any kind of justifying case for them. It is written somewhere, I forget where, by their fruits ye shall know them. Well, indeed, look at their fruits. Look at how history is panned out under the government of religions. For almost all of human history, of recorded human history at any rate, there have been religious leaders, religious teachers, the influence of religious beliefs in society. And we can ask ourselves quite legitimately the question, how has that been for humankind? Has it on the whole been a successful story? And that's something that we should challenge people to understand, because it's been a very important feature of the way religions have survived, not only that they proselytize young children and adults, parents teach their children the same beliefs that their own cultural tradition treasures, but also because they've obscured facts about the past and reinvented themselves in ways that make them more acceptable to any present time. For example, the Church of England in the 1920s, at one of its synods, abandoned the doctrine of hell. We've seen just in recent years the Vatican apologized for its persecution of Galileo. By the way, the anniversary of the trial of Galileo was just 2 days ago, as you may know. Forgetfulness, amnesia about the past and about how the religions behaved in the past is very useful to them, because they can present themselves now as being positive agencies in our societies, doing charitable work, encouraging people to be kind to one another. They complain bitterly, apologists for religion, that atheists and secularists are aggressive and hostile to them in their criticisms of them. I always say, when people talk about militant secularism, I always say, look, when you guys were in charge, you didn't used to argue with us, you just burnt us at the stake. Now what we're doing is we're presenting you with some arguments and some challenging questions, and you complain. In fact, it was T.H. Huxley, Darwin's bulldog, T.H. Huxley, who in a letter to Darwin said, bishops are like, it was not a very kind remark this, by the way, but perhaps nevertheless true. He said, bishops are like pigs. If you poke one, they all squeal. And this is what's been happening in the last 10 years. Criticism is received as an offense, as an affront, and even rather reasonable people like Rowan Williams, Archbishop of Canterbury, use this phrase, militant secularism. And I've always been surprised by that. I've often wondered, for example, what a fundamentalist atheist is. Fundamentalist atheist. Well, what would a non-fundamentalist atheist be? That's somebody who believes that a part of a God exists, maybe. like a left foot or a buttock of a God. Or that God exists on one day in the week, that's Sunday. That's actually what most Christians think, I think. So, I mean, it's very difficult to accept these charges of fundamentalism and militancy when, of course, one look at the landscape of history shows us what militancy and fundamentalism really does mean. So there is that discussion. We've got to look at the history of religions, at their origin, at how they've exercised their influence in history. We have to look at the claims that they make and the arguments they offer. And we have to do this rather as Aristeas, you may remember, I know you were all reading Virgil in the bath last night, so you were reading that story about how Aristeas had chased after Eurydice, thinking she was a deer. She was the beloved of Orpheus, and she stepped on a snake. The snake bit her, she died. She went down to Hades, and Orpheus, with his wonderful music, he went down into Hades to try and bring her back. And you remember that he made the great mistake because he was forbidden to turn around and look at her, and he did that. There are two stories about it, by the way. One is that he couldn't hear her. She was so light of foot that he didn't know that she was actually following him and that Hades had kept his promise. And so he had a quick peek to see if she was there. And sure enough, she was, but she was snatched back into the shadows because he had disobeyed the king of the underworld. And the other story is that she kept saying, Orpheus, if you don't talk to me and turn around and look at me, I'm not coming another step, and so on and so on. So finally, he did turn around and she was snatched back to the shadows again. But the point of the story is that Aristeas, who had caused this, in order to find out what he had done and to hear the story of Orpheus's tragedy with Eurydice, he had to go and capture one of the gods of the sea, Proteus. And as you see from the name Proteus, he had the power of changing himself into all sorts of beasts, animals, writhing serpents, and fierce tigers. And Aristeas had the good fortune to have a river nymph for a mother, and she told him, just hang on to him, hold on to this protean shape. And as he changes shape and changes into all sorts of different things, just hang on to him. And eventually, when he's exhausted all his metamorphoses, he will tell you why it is that you are being punished. And indeed, Aristeas hung on, and he got the story about Orpheus from Proteus. Now, the religions are like Proteus. You criticize them, you attack them, you advance arguments against them, and they immediately change into something else. They say, the apologists of religion say, that's not what I mean by religion, or that's not my understanding of God, or God is ineffable. Nobody can know what God is, and therefore you can't say that there isn't one. You can't prove that there isn't a God. That's not what I understand by my faith, and so on and so on. Just as Dan was saying, it's a swamp, a forest, a fog, and the goalposts, this is a tremendously mixed metaphor, keep shifting. But one has to be persistent, one has to hang on in there, one has to keep challenging them, to ask them what they mean. What is it that they're committed to? If they were going to convert you say, what is it that's going to convert me? Tell me why I should believe. What is the case? What are the grounds? And if there aren't any, if there is no cogent, rational, evidence-based, logical reason for doing it, then we have found the true source of a commitment of a faith nature, and that is that it is deeply and fundamentally an emotional commitment. And that's not an unimportant fact. That's a fact that I think we ought to address in connection with the ethical, with how we live our lives and how we respond to the universe and to one another. And that point I'll come to in just a moment. First, though, very briefly, the second point, the point about secularism. Now, we all know that what we mean by that is the separation of religious organizations, or the distancing of religious influences from matters of public policy. It's terribly important to iterate and reiterate as often as one can that nobody is saying that people are not entitled to believe whatever they like, providing it doesn't harm other people. So you can believe there are fairies at the bottom of the garden. You can even set up a church for that reason. You can try to persuade other people of your view. You can put your point into the public conversation about how things should be organized, and that's perfectly legitimate. And in an open, liberal with a small L society, nobody has a right to stop anybody else from trying to put a point of view. But for historical reasons, the religions have a massively overinflated presence in the public square. Look at the United Kingdom, or more particularly at England, that part of the United Kingdom, which has an established church, the Church of England. Now, about 3% of the population go on a regular basis to a church service. And yet, the Church of England has 26 bishops entitled to sit in the House of Lords and vote on laws that apply to everybody. There are at least four religious programs on the BBC, a publicly funded broadcasting service, every day of the week. Almost every major political and state event begins with prayers or has bishops or the archbishops present at it. So the presence of religion, this reinforcement, which our children are witnessing all the time, the fact that taxpayers' money is used to pay for faith-based schools. I mean, it's often seemed to me that the phrase Roman Catholic school is a kind of oxymoron. I mean, there's a big difference, isn't there, between religious studies, teaching people about religions, especially if you teach them about all the different religions so they can see how silly they all are. But it's a different matter having a school which is premised on a faith outlook, like Judaism or Islam or Christianity. And yet, in a society like England, English society, this is something which is publicly funded. I've always thought that you don't have to present an argument against faith-based schooling. You only need 2 words. And those 2 words are Northern Ireland. And if you mention that to anybody, they'll see the reason why ghettoizing people into faith communities and different faith schools is a terrible mistake. So for these historical reasons, the religions have this massively, massively over-amplified voice in the public debate. And what we should demand of them is that they see themselves for what they are. They are self-interest groups. They're lobby groups. They've got a point of view. They've got beliefs. They want other people to share those beliefs, or they want to try to impose their outlook on life. I've never myself thought that there is any justification for the argument that says, I believe so-and-so, therefore you mustn't do such and such, which is precisely what religious moralists are always saying. Some of you here may remember the great Mary Whitehouse. Do you remember her? Great moralist from the 60s and 70s. The only person in the universe who had a television set that didn't have an off button. So she used to watch everything. She was subjected to hours and hours of nudity on television, which she didn't want anybody else to see. And it always struck me as being very illogical that because she didn't like it, I wasn't allowed to watch it. And this is exactly the view that this voice in the public square is constantly telling us. We don't like this, therefore you mustn't do it. We don't like gays. We don't think that women should be, allowed to do anything at all except stay at home and do the washing up. Therefore, you must do likewise. No. They're interest groups, they're lobby groups. They're entitled to try and persuade us of their view of things. But they are on a par with trades unions, political parties, and other non-governmental organizations. They're civil society organizations. We shouldn't be funding them. They should be funding themselves out of their own constituency. And if they were to do that, and if they weren't allowed to proselytize children in faith-based schools because they weren't getting taxpayers' money for their faith-based schools, then the presence they have in our public square would be much diminished. And that would be a very good thing. And that, I think, is where the secular argument, that is where the secular argument must tend. We must make that case constantly for batting the religions and their organizations, the churches, back into their true perspective. Very often, I've told this to lots of people before, but it's a point worth iterating. I very often go on panels to discuss the secularism issue, the place of religion in public policy matters. And there are invariably 5 men. Always men, because there aren't very many women at the top of any religious organization. There are 5 men. There'll be a Jewish man, a Muslim man, a Catholic man, a Protestant man, and moi. And I am there because I'm a token atheist, secularist, humanist. I got the hairstyle so they didn't have to ask a woman after all. And I always begin the conversation by saying, the reason why there are 4 of them is that they don't agree with one another. In fact, for most of history, they've been fighting one another in the bloodiest of wars. Now they're all making common cause with one another because they want our taxpayers' money for their schools and so on. And then there's one of me. And between them, certainly in the UK, all the major religious groupings probably represent about 8, maybe at the utmost 10% of the population who are regular, committed, observant believers of their religion, who go to mosque or synagogue or temple or church on a very regular basis. And yet most people in the UK are functionally, at very least, secular. They don't want to be run by bishops or mullahs. They want to have an open, diverse, pluralistic public square where all views can be aired and tested and where reason should govern. So that is an illustration, that panel of 5 people, 5 men, is an illustration of the tremendous imbalance in the public square introduced by the historical distortion of the fact that the temporal powers and the religious powers found one another so useful in the past. So that's the thing that in the future we atheists must contest and challenge.
There is a terminological problem here, which may conceal more than just terminological difficulty. The proposition that atheism is true, or that is a misstatement of what I have to prove and what we believe. There's an argument among some of us as to whether we need the word at all. In other words, I don't have a special name for my unbelief in tooth fairies, say, or witches, or in Santa Claus. I just don't think that they're there. I don't have to prove a tooth fairyism. I don't have to prove a Santa Clausism. I don't have to prove a witchism. It's just, I have to say, I think that those who do believe these things have never been able to make a plausible or intelligible case for doing so. That's not agnosticism, because it seems to me that if you don't think there is any evidence, you're wrong to take refuge in saying you're neutral. You ought to have the courage to answer the question, which one is regularly asked: are you an atheist or not? Yes, I will say, I am. You can't tell anything else about me. You can't tell anything else about what I think, about what I believe, about what my politics are, or my other convictions. It's just that I don't believe in the existence of a supernatural dimension, and I've never been shown any evidence that any process observable to us cannot be explained by more satisfactory and more convincing means. The great physicist Laplace, when showing his working model of the solar system to the Emperor Napoleon, was asked, well, your model seems to have no room for a god in it, for deity. And he said, well, Your Majesty, it still all operates without that assumption. Now, here's what you would have to believe if you thought that this was all designed. Dr. Craig gave a slight parody of what I think about this. It could be true, but you'd have to imagine, let's say the human species has been, Homo sapiens has been with us, some people say as long as 250,000 years, some say 200, some say 100,000. Francis Collins and Richard Dawkins oscillate about this. It's not a very big argument. I'll just take 100,000, if you like. You have to imagine that human beings are born. Well, actually, most of them, a good number of them aren't born. They die in childbirth or don't long outlive it. They're born into a terrifying world of the unknown. Everything is a mystery to them, everything from disease to volcanic eruptions. Everything is, their life expectancy for the first, I don't know, many tens of thousands of years would be lucky to be in the 20s, probably dying agonizingly over their teeth, poorly evolved as the teeth are, and from other inheritances from being primates, such as the appendix that we don't need, such as the fact that our genitalia appear to have been designed by a committee, other shortcomings of the species, exaggerated by scarcity, by war, by famine, by competition, and so on. And for 98,000 years or so, heaven watches this with complete indifference. And then, we know where your children go to school, by the way. Heaven watches this with total indifference, and then, with 2,000 years to go on the clock, thinks, actually, it's time we intervened. We can't go on like this. Why don't we have someone tortured to death in Bronze Age Palestine? That should teach them. That should give them the chance of redemption. You're free to believe that, but I think the designer who thought of doing it that way was a very cruel, capricious, random, bungling, and incompetent one. The news of this, Dr. Craig talks as if, okay, but since then there have been more people born, so it might have been a good time in terms of population growth. Well, there are a huge number of people in the world who still haven't even heard of this idea. The news hasn't penetrated to them. Or where it has, it's been brought to them by people who Dr. Craig doesn't think of as Christians, such as Mormons, for example. And it's taught to them in many discrepant and competitive and indeed incompatible and violently irreconcilable ways. And there's been a lot of argument in the church and the churches all this time about, well, okay, what is the answer to that? What about all the people who never could have heard the good news, or who never will hear it, or still haven't been reached by it, and who've died not knowing about it? What happens to them? How can they be saved? Well, the argument is that it's all somehow made retrospective. And as with so many of these arguments, I just comment on these, well, how convenient. Because if you're willing to make assumptions of this kind, then really evidence is only ancillary to what you are advancing. Now, I didn't have the chance. Oh, and just on Mr. Wright, sorry, I scrawled a note to myself. In your first round, Doctor, you said that N.T. Wright, as an impressive person, says that no explanation of the success of Christianity is possible that doesn't rest on the terms of its being true. In other words, Wright says it was so successful, it must have been, and the people were so strongly motivated to believe it that it must have been true. I regard that as a very, very unsafe assumption. Or if it is a safe one, then it must surely apply to Islam and to Mormonism. I mean, these are two very, very, very fast-growing religions, have people prepared to sacrifice enormously for it, have ancestors who were absolutely determined of the truth of it at the time, and who made extraordinary conquests in its name. If you're going to grant this for one religion, it seems to me you have to be willing, not just willing, you may indeed be compelled to make this concession for all of them. And that, I think, would be not just an unsafe assumption, but for most of you here, a distinctly unwelcome one. Now, I didn't get the chance, because I out-talked myself, and I'm sorry for it, to get to the moral dimension. And I'm interested that the word objective morality is the one that Dr. Craig chooses. Usually arguments about morality are whether morality is, so to say, absolute, or whether it's relative. As to objectivity, I think it's a very good compromise word, by the way, and I'm very happy to accept it. But the problem with morality is this, in respect of religion. You can't prove that anyone behaves any better if they refer this problem upward to a supreme dictator of a celestial kind. There are two questions that I've asked in public, and I'll try them again, because I try them on every audience. They're very simple ones. First, you have to name for me, or challenges, let's say, rather than questions. You have to name for me an ethical action or an ethical statement, or moral action, moral statement made or undertaken by a believer that I couldn't undertake or say, I couldn't state or do. I haven't yet had an example pointed out of that to me. In other words, that a person of faith would have an advantage by being able to call upon divine sanction. Whereas if I ask you to think of a wicked act undertaken by someone in the name of God or because of their faith, you wouldn't have, or a wicked statement made, you wouldn't have that much difficulty, I think, in coming up with an example right away. The genital mutilation community, for example, is almost exclusively religious. The suicide bombing community is almost exclusively religious. There are injunctions for genocide in the Old Testament. There are injunctions and warrants for slavery and racism in the Old Testament too. There's simply no way of deriving morality and ethics from the supernatural. When we come to the question of the absolute, well, the most often cited one is the Golden Rule, the one that almost everyone feels they have in common. The injunction not to do to others as you wouldn't want them to do to you. This doesn't, in fact, come from the Sermon on the Mount or from Christianity, or it doesn't originate with it. It's certainly adumbrated by Rabbi Hillel, the Babylonian rabbi, and it's to be found in the Analects of Confucius too. But it has, since we're talking about objective, relative, and absolute, a crucial weakness in it, unfortunately. We'd like to be able to follow it, but it's only really as good as the person who's uttering it. In other words, if I say, I won't treat you as I don't want you to treat me, what am I to do when confronted with Charles Manson? I want him treated in a way that I wouldn't want to be treated myself. Anything else would surely be completely relativistic. So the argument isn't at all advanced by saying that I couldn't know any of this. I couldn't have any moral promptings. I couldn't decide for myself if I see a pregnant woman being kicked in the stomach, that because she's pregnant, that's obviously worse than if it was just a woman who wasn't pregnant being kicked in the stomach. This is part of my patrimony as a human being. It's part of the essential emotional solidarity that I need to have with my fellow creatures to make us realize that we are brothers and sisters, one with another. We are dependent upon each other. We have duties. We have expectations of one another. And that if we didn't have these and try and fulfill them, we couldn't have got as far as we have. We couldn't have evolved as a species. We couldn't have ever had a society. There's never been a society found where rape and murder and perjury are not condemned. And these moral discoveries long, or absolutes if you want to call them that, long predate the arrival of anything recognizable as monotheism. It's a bit like the argument of free will. People say, well, how do you have free will? Do you think you do have it? Well, it's a very, very difficult subject indeed. Some religions say you don't, in effect, have it, that all is determined by heaven. You're really only a plaything in a larger game. I take that to be some of the point of Calvinism. There are some schools of Islam also that say it is only as Allah wills. There's no will of yours really involved, as long as you're willing to make the prostration and the obedience. So the connection between religion and free will isn't as simple, as easy as some people like to think it is. But I would say, yes, I think we have free will. When asked why I think so, I would have to take refuge in philosophical irony and say, because I don't think we have any choice but to have free will. But at least I know at this point that I'm being ironic, and that some of the irony is at my own expense, and it's a risk I have to be willing to run. But the Christian answer is, of course you have free will. The boss insists upon it. This somewhat degrades the freedom and redefines the idea of will. And it seems to me also that there's something degrading in the idea of saying that morality is derived in the same way, that it comes from on high, that we ourselves are not good enough, that we don't have the dignity, we don't have the self-respect, we don't have the character to know a right action or a right statement when we see it or when we want to perform it. It's this servile element in religion. It's not, strictly speaking, the subject of our debate this evening, I know, but I'm damned if I completely forego it. It's the idea that buried in the religious impulse is actually the wish to be unfree, is the wish for an immovable, unchangeable, celestial authority, a kind of heavenly North Korea that will take our decisions away from us and commit us only to worship and praise and thank a great leader and his son, the dear leader, forever and ever and ever. I'm so glad there's no evidence that this is true. Thank you.
So the other day I was watching a video on YouTube, last Friday to be precise, and one of the points made within the video was so interesting I couldn't help but share it with you guys and see what you think about the theory. So yeah, that's why we're here today. Just to make sure I give the full credit, the video in question was on Alex O'Connor's channel, who I think most of you are probably already familiar with. And if you aren't, please go ahead and check him out. He is easily one of the smartest guys I've found on here, and I certainly believe you'll find his takes on religion super interesting. I'll make sure I leave a link to his channel in the description section below. So anyway, the gentleman has a series on his channel where he asks his fans and followers to submit the most controversial and philosophical texts, then he goes on to react to them on his main YouTube channel. I've watched most of these videos myself, and in the one that inspired this section of the video, one of his followers submitted the following: mourning of deceased loved ones by religious people shows the biological fear of death in them is stronger than their faith in the afterlife. Missing their lost loved ones wouldn't explain the amount of grief, sins, and eternity with them awaits after the blink of an eye in their faith-based timeline. This text stuck out in my mind almost instantly, and at first I couldn't really help but wonder why. Maybe it's because I lost one of my distant cousins around a month ago, and in the daily family meetings where we were planning her funeral, other family members couldn't stop bringing God into every point they made, like saying this must be a part of his grand plan, etc. You guys know the gist of it. And I couldn't help but wonder how these guys can believe in God so much and simultaneously believe that a young lady passing on at the age of 31 and leaving behind a 2-day-old infant is part of this God's grand plan, and still be content with not asking any questions like, how the fuck would this be a net positive in the end, man? Anyway, that's our story for another day. My point in this video was perhaps the subconscious reminder is what packed up my ears when the philosophical take I just read you was mentioned in the video. Now, understand I had already paused the video by this point really they take and figure out if the religious people in my life could have any strong rebuttals if I tried using the point against them in the future. The first rebuttal that came to mind was a religious person can simply claim that, well, how can anyone be sure that both of us will end up in heaven? Because if one does and the other one doesn't, then that's it for us, I'll never reunite with them, and that possibility is why I'm mourning. But that rebuttal doesn't really hold much water because believers still mourn the loss of children, and sometimes this is the worst kind of grief among humans. And as we all know, children are almost guaranteed to make it through the pearly gates of heaven. That's what I'm saying. The rebuttal doesn't really land the way they think it does, unless they think their children will make it into heaven and they won't make it into heaven. And by the way, I need to make it clear, I'm not against grieving. I'm of the same opinion as Vision when it comes to grieving, that grieving is simply love persevering. So yeah, this is just a philosophical exercise within my brain where I was creating scenarios trying to find powerful arguments against them and vice versa. Anyway, the second rebuttal I imagined religious people coming up was that it's an evolutionary reaction because as humans we cannot help but grieve for people we've lost, since in the past every life lost prematurely threatened the existence of the tribe or something like that. And to be honest, I'd be inclined to agree with that if it were not for the fact that one of the things the Bible is really great at is demonizing primal urges and desires among humans, from hooking up before we're married to this. The Bible has clearly not only outlawed these harmless primal desires among humans, but it's also recommended some of the wildest punishments for people who break them. And believe it or not, the Bible is actually against grieving as well. In Luke 19:59-60, the Bible says, to another he said, follow me. But he said, Lord, let me first go and bury my father. And Jesus said to him, leave the dead to bury their own dead. But as for you, go and proclaim the kingdom of God. So my point is, if believers really believe in the Bible and the concept of an afterlife as described in the Bible, then the holy book of fantasy novel gives them plenty of reason not to bother with grieving. How am I tripping, man? Anyway, at this point, I recognized that I was actually getting carried away, so I resumed the video to see where Alex would steer the conversation. He starts by posing another common argument by religious individuals, one that I hadn't even thought of myself. Basically, some religious people who've been asked the question before have commonly responded, of course we believe they're going to heaven, but we are really sad that we're going to be separated from them until we get to heaven too. But Alex also acknowledges that this argument still doesn't account for just the sheer amount of grief that people experience when they lose people they really love and care about. And to prove his point, he gives an interesting example from Sherry Kagan's book, Death. Let's say you are a religious individual and your best friend decides that they're going to embark on a scientific expedition where they plan on getting into a rocket, shoot into the stars, and disappear forever. And unfortunately, thanks to limits in technological innovations, once they pass a certain distance away from Earth, you'll no longer be able to contact them ever again. Like, that's the last time you'll ever see or hear from them again. You'll certainly be upset about this, won't you guys? But now I want you to consider what you feel in this scenario compared to what you would feel if the friend got into the spaceship and instead of shooting into the stars as planned, the spaceship explodes immediately after takeoff, and it's reported your best friend lost their life almost instantly. It's safe to assume that you'll be way more upset about the second scenario compared to the first one, and if that's actually the case, then Alex brilliantly points out that the thing you're actually sad about isn't just the fact you'll never see or hear from them again. It must be something about death itself that makes you uneasy. And needless to say, this wouldn't be the case if you had 100% faith that there was an afterlife and it's a beautiful one. So yeah, that's it for today, guys. What did you think about the arguments laid out in the video and the rant I just went on about grief? I don't know why conversations like these make me feel so uneasy and unsure about everything in the end. Yeah. Anyway, I really look forward to hearing everything you think in the comment section below, and thanks a lot for your continued support. I hope you'll tune in again the day after tomorrow at the same time for another dose of sharp arguments against religion from some of the most brilliant minds to ever exist. Thanks a bunch, guys, and peace.